Nice to see everyone here today. Nice to walk through the Academy for the first time in a while and bump into former residents and friends. So it's been terrific to see. And I appreciate the pictures that you showed. One in particular I like of Brenda and I on the beach about a half a century ago with her hand in her mouth, and that's because that's the way you used to do selfies, as you'd set your camera and run to try and get there in time, and she didn't think I was going to make it. So I remember her shivering. Now we have somebody else take the pictures, I guess, but it worked out very nicely, and I do appreciate that. And something else I noticed, and you mentioned the pleasure of co-authoring a textbook with Bob and Mark Lieberman. It touches me that we've lost Mark just recently, and thank you for showing that. I have a couple of things that I would love to talk about today, and I appreciate the panelists this morning and the topics that everyone talked about. They've been issues that we've been considering for many, many years. I have a couple of things to share that might be relevant to that conversation, if I can. Now, let me say something about our colleges and universities as well. They are really thriving through all of the difficulties we faced these last several years. Let me say that we're gaining and distributing new knowledge. That's what our faculty and students do. We're more popular than ever. At our own university, we have more applications, more research, more fundraising, and higher graduation rates now than ever in our history. So we're pleased, but we know that it takes a lot through all of this time. And let me begin by really thanking Prevent Blindness, the Glaucoma Research Foundation, and the Society of Shaffer Fellows for sponsoring this event and inviting me to be here with everybody this morning. I have three basic objectives today. I want to use the time to discuss a critical challenge that faces all of us as physicians and as people, really, and maybe give us a chance to think of some ways we might help to move the needle. And I also want to take a moment to celebrate the lives and contributions of my friends Bob and Virginia Shaffer. I had a chance to work with Bob for the last part of his career, roughly the last quarter of his career, and he represented really well the values of the 20th century physician leader. He was impeccably trained, he was well-mannered, he was generous and kind, he was selfless in the way he taught students and residents and colleagues. It was never about him, it was always about the science, about the clinical outcome, always about the patient. And I remember subtle details in Bob's presentation as well. He was always impeccably dressed. He wore a starched, clean, white lab coat every day. And he was unfailingly forthright and honest, and that made him respected and revered by the ophthalmic community. In fact, his was one of the first two textbooks I bought as an intern, preparing for residency, and years later when I sat for boards, he was, it seemed, naturally chair of the board. So he really represented the values of the 20th century physician, and in many ways he was authentically that person. The other Shaffer that was a really profound educational influence on me was Bob's wife, Virginia. Virginia was Bob's wife for 68 years. Bob died at about 94, 95. Virginia lived to be 103. Quite a marriage they had. Among the cherished and terrifying traditions of the UCSF residency was a thing that we called the second year talk. And this was that every second and third year resident would give a talk you'd be the main presenter at Grand Rounds. And Grand Rounds was a weekly conference of about 100 residents, full-time faculty, and volunteer clinical faculty from throughout the city. So one week the speaker would be Don Gass or Bill Hoyt, but then the next time it was you. Kind of scary. The second year talk was particularly frightening because you had 2 years to worry about it, and it sort of set your place in the pecking order. Virginia Shaffer had taught public speaking at San Francisco State University, and she served as your coach and critic. You had a departmental faculty member to talk about the science, but Virginia was there to teach you how to give a talk. And she went over every detail of how to make slides, how to pace yourself, how to stand, and so on. And then to make sure that this experience was seared in your memory, when you finished the talk, you go upstairs with your fellow residents and faculty to the Proctor Library and sit around a table, and then Virginia would criticize you in front of your colleagues step by step. Ouch. And let me just say, she took no prisoners. She's like Bob, she was unfailingly gracious and well-mannered, but she was also honest and straightforward. And honestly, I remember her criticisms to this day. They have guided me 1,000 times in talks I've given since then. And of course, remember her very kind encouragement and support. It's meant a great deal for me as well. And so the Shaffers were, as I've said, real 20th century role models. They and others like them built our incredibly impactful and successful healthcare enterprise, one of the most successful and impactful that the world has ever known. But now we're a generation later. And when we're a generation later looking back on things, it's good to examine that past and our present, but to look forward to the future and say, how are we doing? What have we learned? How might we conduct ourselves to create a healthier future and a better world? You know, the practice of medicine is a noble privilege. I had a student at UCSF in the 90s, Jan Murray, now a professor at UC Davis, and she gave a talk at homecoming entitled The Privilege of Practice. I remember two main points from that. First, we're all incredibly privileged to be able to practice medicine. We're engaged in something that does so much good for people. It does a lot of things for us as well. It gives us status and employment. It's a real privilege for us to have been able to be educated. So it's a wonderful thing, wonderful privilege to be engaged in the practice of medicine. Second thing I remember, though, maybe more piercingly, that she focused on in her talk was that the real privilege that we have is that our patients come to us often at their most vulnerable and weakest moments. They trust us in ways they don't trust perhaps anyone else in their lives. And we have really a sacred responsibility to earn and to deserve that trust. And we work to really make it that that trust is valued in a way that we serve the patient with the patient's interest in mind. And so that real privilege is that we are taken into people's lives at their most vulnerable points and trusted as being there. As we began medical training, we learned a few key principles that guide us through practice. The sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship, the importance of honesty and confidentiality, and the first rule of medicine, which is primum nos nocere, first do no harm. And I question here this morning if that's really enough. In today's world, even if we are steadfast and true, we are dealing with a world that in fact has inherent inequities. And if we're neutral, if we're just fair to everyone, aren't we simply perpetuating inequity by being neutral? Paraphrasing Plato, treating unequal people the same results in inequity of outcome. And this brings us to fundamental questions that we must ask ourselves today, which is, what does it mean to be a good doctor? We, in the panel this morning, saw different aspects of inequity, and it was the pandemic that we have just, I've just gone through, forgive me, we're still dealing with. The pandemic really has thrown this into stark relief. The virus was neutral. It didn't behave or have judgment. It really behaved as viruses do, which is that it did everything it could to infect hosts, to replicate, to mutate, and to infect other hosts. The differential effect that it had on different populations, the differential effect it had on different people comes from how we treat those people, how those people are situated in our society. As one of our colleagues was saying, there's no difference in the biology of the people. It really is the world that they live in. And you know, there were stark differences in who was most likely to get laid off, who was most likely to lose a business, who was most likely to become infected at all, and particularly who was most likely to suffer serious health consequences or even to succumb. And the effects are really profound. The National Center for Health Statistics recently released data that showed the sharpest decline in U.S. life expectancy in nearly a century. And the steepest decline was for Native Americans and Alaskan Natives, whose life expectancy was shortened by 4 years in the year 2020 alone. An amazing, amazing statistic. We know if we look around the world, there have been circumstances that have done this in other places. We saw this with the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s, or with the AIDS epidemic as it struck sub-Saharan Africa in the 90s, or with the Rwandan genocide, that the life expectancy in a whole nation would drop. But we hadn't seen this in our country in anything like our lifetimes. And we know that happened here, but it didn't happen, for instance, in South Korea or Japan. There was no difference in life expectancy there. So it's important for us to know, or to look at the risk factors in our world that tend to affect the way that people are affected by disease. And in the beginning of the pandemic, you know that there were many occupational comorbidities and other things that affected the health and safety of people who were impacted by COVID. In the past 18 months, though, there's been a fascinating change, and that is the most powerful modifiers of risk included your educational level, maybe as expected, but also your political orientation. Those things affected your likelihood to be vaccinated and dramatically affected your likelihood to live or die. If we're to be the very best doctors and health practitioners we can be, we have to recognize the world we live in and practice accordingly. We have to work to produce the equitable outcomes that we believe are appropriate. I have a couple of things where I was thinking about how to explain equity to an audience. Again, this this audience understands these things well. A study I heard described once that I explained it, though, just repeat that. And it was a study done by many people in different ways, but this one, it was looking at the time it took for people to cross the street, where cars had to stop to allow a pedestrian to cross the street. And the study was done to compare black and white people crossing the street. And so similarly dressed study subject would approach the intersection, and then they would time how long it took for a car to stop to let them cross. And on average, in this particular study, it was 32 seconds longer to cross the street for the black study subjects compared to the white study subjects. Interestingly, another study looked at when people arrived at work at the same time and found that the managers generally felt that there was more tardiness in the black population than the white population, even when there was no difference in tardiness. And finally, they looked at the punishment for tardiness in the two populations and found that black employees were punished more for being tardy than white employees. So if you go back to the beginning, it takes you, with the same effort, longer to get to work. And when you get there, you're perceived as being late even when you're not. And when you're perceived as being late, you're punished more than your coworkers. And within all of this, the thing that was so important is that none of the people who were involved had any idea that they were doing this. No one did this on purpose. These were unconscious, learned behaviors that were the normal way that people were behaving. The cars didn't choose who they were going to stop for. They just didn't stop. And things like that happen 100 times, 1,000 times a day, a week, all the time with all of us. And it's those things cumulatively that build up to the disparities that we see over the years. The sociologist I will recommend to you, David Williams at Harvard University, done years of research on these areas, on the subtle, subconscious, ubiquitous behaviors that we all practice. And I think his work really does expand understanding, and I commend it to you. And I want to say one more thing. I'm going to change what I was going to say to give an example of something I learned a few years ago that affects one of the things we were hearing about on the panel, and that is the challenge of talking about racism, the challenge of dealing with racism, how to get people to understand and change. And something I'd like to share, which I hope I don't mean it to be non-hopeful, but I think it's a reality that we should affect. And let me tell you the circumstances under which it occurred. And I'll use my prerogatives to pause my timer for a moment. So I was at one of my universities. We had a challenge in our marching band, and we had a history of hazing in the band. And I'll just say that it was very, very serious and led to things that had people convicted of crimes for which they were sent to the penitentiary, and so completely serious things. And it became my task to dismiss the extraordinarily popular leader of this organization because there had not been appropriate attention on these things. I don't think this was a bad person, let me say. I think he was actually following the trends and traditions that he'd been trained in, but the outcomes were really unacceptable if you stood back and looked at them. I'd arrived new. This happened to me within the first 3 weeks of the new job, and so I hadn't really been a part of the tradition, but I felt that something had to be done, and so we said we have a zero tolerance for hazing, and we're going to make a change. They did a survey in the local newspaper and asked people whether or not they thought this was the right thing to do or not. 92% said no. So I was saying to someone, if you didn't count the undecideds, I had an 8% approval rating. So it's a great place to start. Let me say that during the year, there was great emotion involved in this, and during the year, I met with people who'd been involved in this over time. And at first I met with a group of alums and others, and I'll say this was emotional for them, but alums and others, and I got from them that they knew that the first thing I thought was that they knew that the hazing was wrong, but they didn't believe that it was, or excuse me, let me say it in a different way. They knew that the hazing was unacceptable, but they didn't believe it was wrong. It was unacceptable. You can't let people know about this, but you know it's the way we do things, that's okay. And we talked about that, and we had to try to get them to believe that it was wrong. And I think that there was a lot of change. The Me Too movement came along, et cetera, and they understood that. But then as I worked through this, and let me say that I was sued personally for millions of dollars, and it was a big deal for us. As we got through it even more, we found that there was another group of very hardcore people within the depths of the organization who knew that the hazing was unacceptable. And they knew it was wrong, but they believed it was imperative. They believed that it was an important and necessary thing to do in order for people to actually be great band members. And they thought that the quality of the organization, the quality and their success depended on going through the hazing. So just hearing about it, or just having rules about it, or making it a difficult thing to do had no effect on their behavior. It was something that they felt compelled to do because they felt that it was necessary. And I think when we're dealing with people and we're trying to move away from the practices that we all see that cause so much challenge, and trying to get people to change away from behaviors that are racist, there's going to be an extraordinarily hardcore group that say, gosh, I know this is unacceptable. You know, it's probably even wrong, but I think it's necessary to preserve my way of life, to create the world that I want to live in, et cetera. So I think this work is hard work, and we need to do it, and I applaud everyone here and elsewhere who's doing the work, but the work is really hard and requires a consistent effort. I have something I wanted to share with the group, since I'm now flashing, something I wanted to share with the group. Just as a little practice that I employ that tries to help me keep in touch with the people that we're dealing with, to make sure that we see them and we know that they're there. And I think that seeing them and knowing that they're there helps us keep them in our minds, and keeping them in our minds helps us to continue pushing on our institutions to be appropriate in the way that we deal with them. At UCSF, I had the privilege for many years of giving the introductory talk to the medical school class, and it was great. And I told them the normal things that you would say: study hard, get some sleep, make sure to get exercise, call your parents, call your families, stay connected. I also, though, would tell them that I thought they should, as they were walking through the medical center, that they should talk to people, not the people in the white coats, but people who had their names stenciled on their shirt or blouse pockets, their first names, and just say hello to them and make eye contact with them and treat them as people. And I always thought that was a good thing to remember to do as we were rushing around to stay connected, and I tried to do that. And it was a good thing, I think. I got one up on that a little bit ago, and there's something I try to do now that I learned about. I was having brunch, sitting, as we all have done this last March. I was sitting on the Upper West Side in a parking place that was made into a place to sit and eat, and with an old friend of mine, Erwin Redliner, his wife Karen, and they are very much in. He's a physician, and she runs a public services organization. They do great work. But we were there to have brunch and chat, and an unkempt person, looked like a person who was unhoused, came up to us, as people do, to ask for money. And my approach to those people over the years is I've usually give them a polite denial, knowing that we give money to organizations, et cetera, that support them. That's been my approach. Erwin did something different. When the person walked up, he reached his pocket to pull out $1, and then he asked him his name and where he was from, and how he was doing, and if he knew where to get services, and then gave him the $1 and then said goodbye to him by name. And I would guess that was the only person that treated him with any respect that whole day, if not that week. And it again reminded me of how we can really take a moment and touch those people that we see that are within our sphere, who are in different circumstances, and by doing that, maybe make sure they're in our minds as we're doing our daily work. So let me finish. A couple of things to say. That we're blessed to work in a noble healing profession. Our world is filled with inequity. We need to recognize and acknowledge that. On a macro scale, as citizens, work to do all we can to eliminate health-robbing inequities. We must heal the hive like our bee colleagues do. On a smaller level, we must meet our patients where they are and compensate for the inequities that they face as we help them in their quest for a healthy life. And as individuals, we should recognize the humanity in all of our fellow citizens, no matter their condition or circumstance. We, every day, can do small things that combat inequality, and by doing so, make the world a healthier and better place. On that note, let me acknowledge that the pandemic has been a truly terrible period for our world, and especially in many ways for those who work in healthcare. And I know that all of you here have felt the toll over these past few years. It's been a hard time with burnout, and that burnout is real. But you're here today, and that means you not only survived, but you care deeply about your work, about your patients, and about serving the world with your gifts as physicians. So as I close, I'd like to invoke with gratitude the legacy of Bob and Virginia Shaffer and Arthur Ashe, who had the line, "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." And all those others who taught us and inspired us. We stand on their shoulders and we work to improve on their message. Let us take care of each other and our world as we strive for excellence and goodness in all that we do. Our motto at the University of California is Fiat Lux, let there be light. And to all of you who devote your lives to preserving that light, thank you for all that you do. Fiat Lux indeed. Thank you very much for having me this morning. Thank you.